The morning started like any other Saturday in September. Marcus Chen stood on the back patio of his freshly renovated home in suburban Fairmont, coffee mug in hand, watching the early light dance across the surface of his pool. He'd saved for 6 years to install it. 6 years of overtime shifts at the hospital where he worked as a surgical technician, skipping vacations, driving the same 2015 Honda Civic while his colleagues upgraded to newer cars. But it was worth it. The pool was perfect. 12 by 24 feet, heated, with a stone deck that mimicked natural slate. His therapist had suggested he'd benefit from a retreat space, somewhere to decompress after the relentless stress of the operating room. Marcus had taken it seriously. He'd even named it privately to himself, the Sanctuary. The house had a historical charm to it, built in 1987, with a wraparound porch and a detached garage that faced the alley. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where families had lived for decades, where people knew their neighbors' names and collected recipes at summer barbecues. Marcus had moved in 8 months ago, and while he didn't attend those barbecues, his schedule at the hospital made it difficult. He'd waved at the Johnsons next door, helped Mrs. Reeves from across the street carry her groceries, returned the Martins' wayward golden retriever 3 times. He was a good neighbor, or at least he tried to be. The back gate stood open slightly. Marcus had opened it an hour ago to let the landscaper out after the Friday service. The crew had trimmed the hedges, cleaned the gutters, and refreshed the pavers around the pool deck. He made a mental note to latch it properly. The neighborhood was safe, but he'd read enough news to know that complacency was how trouble started. Marcus took a sip of his coffee, a dark roast he'd ordered from a specialty place downtown, ground the night before and breathed in the September air. There was a crispness to it, the first hint of autumn. In a few weeks, he'd have to drain the pool and prepare it for the colder months. He'd already researched the process obsessively, watched 3 YouTube tutorials, and bookmarked an article from a pool maintenance website. His phone buzzed. A text from his mother, "Did you eat breakfast? You always skip breakfast." He smiled despite himself. His mother, Patricia Chen, had never quite accepted that her son was a grown man capable of managing his own nutrition. She still texted him reminders about vitamins, sent him articles about heart health, and occasionally left casseroles on his doorstep despite his protests. He texted back, "Made eggs. Mom, I'm 34. The response came immediately, "You're my baby, always will be. Love you." "Love you too." Marcus set his phone down and finished his coffee. The sun was climbing higher now, the temperature rising. It would be a warm day, perfect for a swim later. He had the evening off, a rarity in his schedule, and he'd already planned to dive in around 5 o'clock, right when the angle of the sun would create that perfect balance of light and warmth. The sound of a large engine pulled him from his thoughts. It wasn't the usual morning noise of the neighborhood, no garbage trucks or delivery vans. This was different, heavier, aggressive, the kind of engine that announced itself. Marcus turned toward the side of the house. Through the gap where his driveway met the neighbor's property line, he could see movement. A large vehicle was approaching, not on the street but on the sidewalk bordering his property. His first thought was confusion. His second thought was alarm. He set down his coffee mug on the small table beside his lounge chair and moved quickly toward the gate. The back gate was indeed still open, and through it he could now hear voices, multiple voices. A woman's voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the others. "Just pull it right through there. The driveway's too narrow, but this space is perfect. There's plenty of room." Marcus pushed through the gate. What he saw would replay in his mind for months afterward, every detail preserved with crystalline clarity. The kind of memory that trauma creates, where the brain refuses to let you forget a single moment. A platinum blonde woman in designer sunglasses and white linen was directing a black Cadillac Escalade through the gap in his fence. The SUV was enormous, easily 8,000 pounds of metal and chrome. Behind it, a young man in his early 20s sat in the driver's seat, his face anxious, clearly following instructions that terrified him. Behind the Escalade on the street, a second vehicle idled, a Range Rover in champagne gold. The blonde woman turned toward Marcus, and he saw her face fully for the first time. She was perhaps 45, with sharp cheekbones and the kind of aggressive beauty that comes from expensive skincare and personal trainers. Her eyes, visible beneath her sunglasses, were bright and cold. "You," she said, pointing a manicured finger at Marcus. "Are you the owner?" Marcus found his voice, though it came out smaller than he intended. Yes, this is my property. What are you? What is this? I'm Karen, the woman said, as if her name explained everything. As if it were a credential, a title of authority. I'm having work done on my house. The driveway's not big enough for 2 vehicles while the contractors are here. I'm parking here. I'll move it in 3 hours. Marcus looked at the Escalade, now fully through the gate and positioned against his pool deck. The vehicle was massive. The wheels were only a few feet from the water's edge. You can't park here, he said. This is private property. You need to move your car immediately. Karen looked at him over the rim of her sunglasses. I said 3 hours, don't be difficult. She turned away from him and pulled out her phone, already dismissing him. She was someone accustomed to being obeyed, to moving through the world with the confidence of a person who had never been told no and truly had to accept it. Marcus felt something hot rising in his chest. Not anger, not yet. Shock, disbelief. He was being invaded on his own property by a woman who was speaking to him like he was an inconvenient staff member. No, he said louder now. No, you need to move your car right now. This is trespassing. You're trespassing on private property. Karen didn't even look back. She was already walking toward the gate, toward the Range Rover on the street. Call the cops if you want. Tell them a neighbor parked in her neighbor's driveway. They'll laugh at you. Marcus stood frozen, watching her approach the Range Rover. The young man in the Escalade, he'd figured out by now that this was probably her son, was looking at him apologetically through the window. The hot feeling in Marcus's chest was anger now, pure, undiluted anger. But it was mixed with something else, uncertainty. Karen had seemed so confident, so assured of her right to be here. What if she was right? What if this was legal and he was the one being unreasonable? He pulled out his phone with shaking hands and did what he'd been trained to do in the hospital. Look up the problem. He opened Google and typed, "Can someone park on your private property without permission?" The answer was clear. No, property law was explicit. A person could not park on someone else's private property without permission. Trespassing, criminal trespass potentially. But how to prove she didn't have permission? How to enforce it when she'd already left, confident in her own superiority? Marcus stood in his own backyard, surrounded by the carefully curated elements of his sanctuary, and felt it being violated. 3 hours passed. Marcus didn't swim. He couldn't. The Escalade sat there, hulking and wrong, as if it had been photographed in place to remain as a permanent monument to his powerlessness. He sat inside his house, laptop open, searching for his options. He found the non-emergency police line and called it. The dispatcher was sympathetic but unhelpful. Has the vehicle caused any damage? She asked. No, but... Then it's a civil matter, sir. You could call a towing company, but you'd be responsible for the cost if the owner disputes it. And parking in someone's driveway isn't always illegal in this jurisdiction, depending on circumstances. You'd want to consult a lawyer about your specific situation. A lawyer over a parking space. The absurdity of it made Marcus feel small. He did research on towing companies. Most required proof of ownership or a property owner's permission, and many were reluctant to tow residential vehicles from disputes between neighbors. Too much liability, too many legal gray areas. At 4 o'clock, the Escalade was still there. At 5 o'clock, the Escalade was still there. Marcus had planned to swim. He didn't. At 6 o'clock, he called Karen's house. He'd knocked on her door at 5:45, but no one answered. The house was a massive modern structure, all sharp angles and floor-to-ceiling windows, built on a lot that was twice the size of his own. He could see the driveway from his angle on the street, and indeed there appeared to be a contractor's van parked there. A woman answered his call. Her voice was wary. Is this about the parking? She asked before he could even explain. Yes, you said 3 hours. It's been over 4. I need you to move your car immediately. There was a pause. He could hear background noise, music, or a television. I'm still not ready to leave. It'll be done soon. Soon isn't acceptable. You need to move. The line went dead. She'd hung up on him. Marcus stood in his kitchen, phone in hand, and felt something shift inside him. This was the moment where he could have let it go, where he could have chosen to be the bigger person, to demonstrate patience and forbearance. This was the moment where his therapist's advice about managing stress might have served him well. Instead, he called a towing company. The dispatcher at Fairmont Recovery was a businesslike woman named Sandra. She asked questions about the vehicle, its location, whether the property was posted with no trespassing signs, whether he was the owner of the property, and whether there was potential for damage from the tow. The vehicle is parked less than 3 feet from a swimming pool, Marcus explained. With the angle of the crane and the tow hook, there's definitely risk of it sliding into the water during removal. There was a long pause. "That's actually perfect," Sandra said, and Marcus heard the smile in her voice. "That makes it trespassing and a safety hazard. I'll send a driver, 20 minutes. The tow truck arrived at 6:37 in the evening. Marcus watched from his back patio as the massive flatbed vehicle backed slowly into his driveway, manipulating itself with surprising delicacy through the tight space. The driver, a weathered man with a gray beard and a faded tattoo on his neck, moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this thousands of times. He looked at the Escalade's position next to the pool, let out a low whistle, and approached Marcus's back door. "That's your car?" he asked, pointing. "No, it's the neighbor's." "She know I'm towing it?" "No." The driver grinned. "That's the fun part then. This one's going to make some noise." He returned to the tow truck and positioned it. The process was mechanical, inexorable. The driver extended the tow crane, positioned the hook, and began the lift. The Escalade's front wheels came off the ground first, then the rear, the vehicle ascending with a slow, steady inevitability. Metal creaked. The crane operator swiveled the vehicle, angling it toward the flatbed. It was at this exact moment that Karen appeared. She came through the side gate in a fury, running, her expensive white linen now partially unbuttoned, her face a mask of disbelief. Behind her, the young man, her son definitely, jogged to catch up, his face pale. "Stop, stop," Karen screamed. Put it down right now." The tow truck driver didn't even pause. He was positioned in the cab, his face visible through the side window, and he turned to look at her with an expression of professional indifference. "Lady, the car is coming up," he called. "Should have moved it sooner." Karen's face transformed. The controlled fury became panic. Actual, authentic panic. She looked at Marcus, and there was a moment, just a moment, where Marcus saw her not as an invader, but as a person confronted with something irreversible. Then her expression hardened again. "Do you know who I am?" she shrieked at Marcus. "Do you understand what you've just done? That car is a gift from my husband. My husband is going to destroy you, legally, financially. He knows people, powerful people." Marcus felt his stomach twist. He'd known intellectually that this might happen, that Karen might retaliate, but knowing it in the abstract and hearing it stated as fact were different things. "It's on private property," he said, his voice barely steady. "You parked illegally." "I parked on my neighbor's property as a temporary measure, and you responded with a tow truck. That's not justice. That's sadism." The Escalade was fully on the flatbed now. The driver secured the chains with professional speed. The whole process from the driver's arrival to the final attachment had taken less than 15 minutes. Karen pulled out her phone with shaking hands. "I'm calling the police. I'm pressing charges. I'm calling my lawyer. That car is worth $200,000, and you're going to pay for every second it sits in an impound lot." Marcus turned away from her. He went back into his house and closed the patio door. Inside, the silence was profound. The house felt empty in a way it hadn't before. He stood in his kitchen, listening to the tow truck reverse out of his driveway, listening to Karen's muffled screams from outside, and understood that he had just made a decision that would reshape the landscape of his life. He hadn't meant to destroy anything. He'd simply wanted his property back. But Karen was the kind of woman who didn't understand the difference between disrespect and self-defense. The police did come, exactly 40 minutes later. 2 officers, one male and one female, both looking tired and skeptical. They took statements from both Marcus and Karen, who had now positioned herself on his front porch, demanding he answer her in front of witnesses. "He towed my car without authorization," she told the officers. "From her private property," Marcus countered, "which I was well within my rights to do." The female officer, whose name tag read Ramirez, sighed. "Mr. Chen, did you post any no trespassing signs? Did you give her explicit permission to park on your property?" "No permission, but no, I didn't post signs. I didn't think I'd need them on my own property." "And you, ma'am, The male officer turned to Karen. "You parked here with permission." "It's a neighborly accommodation." "Which the neighbor didn't accommodate," Officer Ramirez said flatly. "You parked on someone else's property without their permission. He called a tow truck. That's not illegal. It's annoying, but it's not illegal." Karen's face went very still. "So he can just tow my car?" "If it's on his property and he didn't give permission, yes." "And I have no recourse?" Officer Ramirez exchanged a glance with her partner. "You could sue him civilly for damages, emotional distress, whatever, but this isn't a criminal matter. We're not getting involved." The officers left. Karen remained on the porch for another 30 seconds, staring at Marcus with an expression that was part shock, part calculation. "You've made an enemy," she said quietly. "You understand that, right? This isn't over." Then she left, walking to her Range Rover with rigid posture, still in her unbuttoned white linen, looking like someone who had lost something precious and was already planning her revenge. Marcus closed the door. He didn't swim that evening either. The pool sat empty in the growing darkness, still perfect but no longer a sanctuary. It had become a mirror of his own doubt. He'd been right, technically. He'd been within his rights, but Karen was also right about one thing: this wasn't over. Monday morning, when he pulled into his parking spot at Metropolitan Hospital, he found a flyer under his windshield wiper. It was printed on heavy stock, professional quality. The header read, "Dangerous neighbor do not trust." Below that were photos, his address, his phone, apparently pulled from the hospital's website, and a description of the Saturday incident written in language that made it sound like Marcus had attacked Karen rather than towed her illegally parked car. The flyer was already on several other cars in the parking lot. Marcus's hands shook as he gathered them up. He looked around, but there were no security cameras in this section of the lot, and no one seemed to have noticed him. He sat in his car and read the full text, his stomach sinking. "This man stole my car. He towed an illegally parked vehicle in a targeted harassment campaign. He is unstable and dangerous. If you live near this address, take precautions. He may target your property next." It was brilliant in its way. Technically, nothing in it was false. She had parked illegally. He had towed it. But the narrative she'd constructed, that he'd targeted her, that he was dangerous, that he was a threat to the neighborhood, was effective manipulation. He texted his supervisor that he was running late and drove back to the hospital's HR office before his shift. "I need to make a report," he told the woman at the desk. Her name was Diane, and she'd processed his orientation paperwork when he'd been hired 2 years ago. She looked confused. "What kind of report?" "Someone is distributing flyers with my address and photo, claiming I'm dangerous. It's harassment. It's also potentially defamation." Diane's confusion deepened. "Is this related to hospital business?" "It's being distributed in the employee parking lot." "I see." She took one of the flyers, Marcus had several, and scanned it. Her professional expression didn't change, but he could see her eyes moving through the text. "This person is claiming you stole her car." "I towed her car from my private property. She had parked illegally without permission. She's my neighbor and she's retaliating." "Do you have documentation that you own the property and that she parked without permission?" "I have text messages with her asking about the parking duration. I have the tow company's documentation. I have everything." Diane leaned back in her chair. "The hospital can't get involved in personal disputes between neighbors, Mr. Chen. We can document the flyer and report it to security, but beyond that, you're looking at small claims court or a lawyer." "She's distributing these in our parking lot. That's on hospital property." "I understand that, and we'll address it, but the hospital won't take legal action on your behalf for something that occurred on your personal property with your neighbor." She paused. "I would recommend speaking with a lawyer, though. This does sound like defamation or harassment, potentially both." A lawyer, again that word. Marcus thanked Diane and left, his sense of control slipping further away. He called a lawyer from his car, parked on the far side of the hospital property. The receptionist scheduled him for a consultation on Wednesday evening. The lawyer's name was Richard Mather, and his office was in a converted townhouse downtown. The space was aggressively masculine, dark wood, leather, law degrees from prestigious schools framed on the walls. Mather himself was in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of tan that suggested a hobby of golf or sailing. "Let me see these flyers," Mather said, settling into his chair. Marcus handed them over. Mather read them carefully, his expression unreadable. "They're aggressive," Mather said finally. "But they're largely protected speech under the First Amendment. She's making assertions about something that actually occurred, the towing, and framing it from her perspective. She doesn't explicitly say you're a criminal, just implies it. She's lying, she's twisting the facts. Yes, but the bar for defamation is high. You'd have to prove that her statements are factually false, not merely misleading or one-sided. And you'd have to prove damages, financial loss, professional harm, something quantifiable. My employer is concerned, the hospital, has already told you they won't take action. Unless this causes measurable damage to your career or finances, defamation is a difficult case." Mather leaned back. "However, harassment might be more promising. If she continues distributing these flyers, if she escalates her behavior, you might have a case for harassment or intentional infliction of emotional distress. So I just have to wait for her to get worse. Or you could try mediation. Sometimes a third party can help neighbors reach an understanding." Marcus left the office no wealthier but slightly more informed. The consultation had cost $300 and had essentially told him what he'd already figured out. Legally, he was in a gray area. He'd been right to tow the car, but she had the right to be angry about it, and her retaliation, while annoying and hurtful, wasn't necessarily illegal. The next morning, there were more flyers. This time, they'd been distributed more broadly. Marcus found them on the windshields of cars near his house when he came home from a night shift. They'd also been posted on neighborhood bulletin boards. Some had been taped to utility poles, though the weather and foot traffic had already torn most of them. The flyer's message had evolved. Now she'd added details that were verifiable but twisted. His address, his place of work, his vehicle information. The text had been reworded to sound less like harassment and more like a civic warning. "Alert, unstable individual in our neighborhood has engaged in targeted harassment and property theft, not to be trusted around vehicles or property. Recent incident, illegal towing of vehicle from neighbor's property as retaliation." That last line was the key. By framing it as retaliation, she was redefining his legal action into an illegal one. Marcus sat in his car reading the flyer and felt something break inside him. A fatigue, a resignation. This was the cost of being right. This was what happened when you stood up to someone like Karen. He called Richard Mather back. "I need you to send her a cease and desist," Marcus said without preamble. "Okay, that'll be another $500 for drafting and delivery." "Do it." The cease and desist letter arrived at Karen's house on a Friday. Marcus knew because she appeared at his front door that evening, the letter clutched in her hand, her face a mask of fury. He didn't open the door. She stood on his porch, screaming loud enough that the neighbors could hear. "You think you can threaten me with lawyers? My husband is a lawyer. He's already started his own countersuit for harassment, trauma, and emotional distress." She was shaking, her expensive clothes and polished nails looking suddenly fragile. "You started this. You had my car towed, and now you're acting like the victim." Marcus watched her from behind his locked door. He said nothing. "I can make your life miserable," Karen continued, her voice hoarse now. "You understand that? I have the resources to bury you. The lawsuits, the flyers, the calls to your employer, this is just the beginning. You're going to regret the day you decided to mess with me." She left, walking back to her house with rigid posture. Her son was visible in the background, looking embarrassed. The cease and desist seemed to work for about a week. The flyers stopped. The posts on neighborhood boards disappeared, but Marcus could feel the tension, the coiled anticipation. Karen hadn't given up. She was planning. She was escalating. The question was how. He found out the following Monday. The first sign was an email at work. It was from a woman he didn't know, someone with a generic email address. The subject line was, "Are you aware of your employee's criminal behavior?" The email detailed the towing incident, framed it as theft and harassment, and included a link to a website. Marcus opened it with trembling hands. It was a whole website, registered to an anonymous account, hosted on a domain service that didn't require identity verification. The website was titled Warning, Local Predator, and featured photos of Marcus's house, his car, even a blurry shot of him taking out the trash. The content was devastating not because it was untrue, but because it was so carefully crafted to make him look insane. The towing incident was presented as an unprovoked attack. The cease and desist was presented as an attempt to silence Karen, and there were speculation sections, blank space where readers could fill in stories about his behavior. Below all of this was a comment section. Several comments had already been posted. I live near here. I've seen him staring at people's properties. This checks out. This is the guy from those flyers? Yeah, stay away from him. His car looks suspicious, probably casing houses, report to police. The comments were almost certainly fake, written by Karen or her son to generate engagement and legitimacy. But that didn't matter. Anyone reading them wouldn't know that. They would just see allegations, corroboration, and warnings. Marcus called Richard Mather again. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the phone. That website is harassment, Marcus said. That's beyond flyers. That's a sustained campaign of defamation. I know, and yes, it's actionable. But pursuing legal remedies here is going to be expensive and time-consuming. She's clearly escalating, which is concerning. Have you considered calling the police? What she's doing now might cross into cyberstalking or harassment under state law. Marcus called the police again. This time, he requested to file a formal complaint. A different officer came to his house, a young man named Tors who looked like he was barely old enough to have a driver's license. Has she threatened you directly? Tors asked, reviewing the website on his phone. The flyers, the website. Her screaming at me from my front porch that she's going to ruin my life. Yes, I'd say that constitutes threats. Those are more like aggressive behavior than direct threats. There's a difference. A threat would be something like, I'm going to hurt you, or I'm going to burn down your house. What you have here is a neighbor who's angry and using social media and flyers to express that anger. She's running a website dedicated to attacking me, which is certainly unpleasant, but also likely protected speech. Has she made any actual threats against your physical safety? Has she caused any direct financial damages? My employer has already been contacted by her. I'm concerned about my job. Then that's your damages claim. But this is civil, Mr. Chen. This is something you sue over, not something we can arrest her for. Tors handed back the phone. I can document this report in the system. If she escalates to direct threats or physical contact, you call us immediately. Otherwise, you're looking at small claims court or a lawyer. After the officer left, Marcus sat in his living room and watched the sun set through his windows. The house felt different now. It didn't feel like a sanctuary anymore. It felt like a bunker, a place where he had to hide from something just outside his walls. He thought about the pool. He hadn't been in it since before the towing. It sat there every day, perfectly maintained, completely unused. On Tuesday, he opened the news and saw that Karen's website had attracted attention. A local journalist, someone who covered neighborhood disputes and small-town conflicts, had picked up the story. The article was titled, "Neighbor Dispute Goes Digital. When Does Self-Defense Become Harassment?" The article was relatively balanced, presenting both sides, but the framing favored Karen slightly. She was interviewed, and she presented herself as a victim. I made a simple request for temporary parking while my home was being renovated. Instead of saying no, he had my car towed. Then when I tried to raise awareness in my community about what I felt was unfair treatment, he came after me with lawyers and cease and desist letters. Marcus was paraphrased briefly, his side of the story reduced to, Chen's lawyer declined to comment for this article. The article concluded, what started as a parking dispute has evolved into a sustained conflict, raising questions about proportional response and neighborhood civility. Proportional response, as if having his car towed was equivalent to a campaign of public harassment. That evening, there was a notification on his phone. A local news station had shared the article. The comments were numerous and vicious. This guy is a sociopath. She tried to be nice and he punished her for it. The guy who towed her car is clearly insane. That's harassment 101. Karen seems like a nice lady. He's the villain here. Marcus realized, reading through the comments, that he had lost control of the narrative. It no longer mattered what had actually happened. It mattered what people believed had happened. And Karen had spent time and energy crafting a story where she was the victim of an unreasonable, unstable neighbor. He had spent no time on PR. He had simply tried to enforce his property rights, and for that, he was being destroyed online. The news article had opened a floodgate. More local outlets picked it up. His name was Googled by people he'd never met. The website Karen had created was now appearing in his search results, the first few hits after Wikipedia and LinkedIn being dedicated to her allegations against him. His mother called him crying after finding the website. "Why didn't you tell me? Why are people saying these things about you?" "Because they're not true, because I towed her car from my property." "But the website says..." "Mom, the website is propaganda. She's angry, and she's using the internet to spread lies about me." "So it's not true?" "No, it's not true. Or rather, it's true that I towed her car, but it's a lie about why and what that means about me as a person." His mother cried more. She wanted him to come home, to stay with her and his father in the city where they lived, to get away from this neighborhood and this woman. He told her he couldn't, that he wouldn't abandon his house to an aggressive neighbor. But her concern, however well-meant, only added to his sense of isolation. The hospital had seen the articles. Diane from HR called him in again, this time with a manager present. They weren't firing him, they assured him, but they were concerned about the situation and its potential impact on hospital reputation. They asked him not to discuss hospital business with anyone, not to use the hospital name or photos in any personal matters, and to be mindful of the fact that his employment reflected on the institution. "Basically," Marcus said afterward, driving home with his hands clenching the steering wheel, "they want me to disappear." He wasn't fired, but he might as well have been. The message was clear. His continued employment was conditional on his ability to keep this situation away from the hospital. One more article, one more mention of his workplace, and they would have to make difficult decisions. Richard Mather sent him a bill for $2,400 in legal fees, and the bad news that a cease and desist against a website was difficult to enforce without proving actual damages. "You could file a suit," Mather said, "but it would cost at least $5,000 to $10,000, and we'd still have to prove defamation, which is hard. And even if you won, she could just create another website under a different name." On Thursday night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, listening to the house's settling sounds, and felt his mind spiraling. Every scenario played out the same way. Karen escalated, he responded, and she found a new way to hurt him that he couldn't defend against. He got up at 3 a.m. and went to the pool. The water was cold now, the September heat having given way to cooler nights. He stood at the edge of the deck, looking at the surface, and thought about drowning in it, not as a serious plan exactly, but as a fantasy. The relief of just stopping, of not having to fight anymore. He was so lost in this thought that he almost didn't hear the noise. It was a metallic sound, sharp and sudden. He looked toward the side of the house and saw a figure moving in the darkness. His neighbor, police, some new incarnation of Karen's harassment. He flipped on the deck lights. The motion activated floods that illuminated the entire backyard. Standing there, spray paint can in hand, was the young man from the Escalade, Karen's son. He was frozen in the light like a deer in headlights, his mouth open in shock. Behind him, on the concrete pool deck, was the beginning of what would have been a message. So far, he'd only completed 3 letters. HEL. "Stop," Marcus said, moving toward him. "Stop right there." The young man bolted. He dropped the spray paint can and ran for the side gate. Marcus chased him, but the kid was faster, younger, and, with the desperation of someone caught in the act, motivated. He made it to the gate and through to the alley before Marcus could catch him. Marcus stood in the alley, breathless, watching the kid disappear into the darkness toward Karen's house. He called the police immediately. Officer Torres came back, the same young cop from before. He took a statement, looked at the partially painted message on the pool deck, and nodded like he'd expected something like this all along. "This is vandalism," Torres said. "Do you want to press charges?" Yes, absolutely." "Can you identify the person who did it?" "It's Karen's son. He came from her house. She's the one who sent him." "Did you see her send him?" "No, but..." "Then you can't prove she sent him. You can identify the suspect and I'll file a report. Whether charges get filed is up to the DA's office. But I can tell you, first offense, trespassing and vandalism on someone's property. He'll probably get probation and restitution if it gets that far." Torres filed the report. The next morning, Marcus woke to find Karen at his front door again. She was calmer this time, but there was a brittleness to her, like someone operating on the edge of control. "My son was arrested," she said without preamble. "I didn't arrest him. I reported vandalism to the police. He's 17 years old. He was trying to paint on a surface. That's not a crime worthy of arrest. He was trespassing on my property and vandalizing it. That is, in fact, a crime. Karen's face hardened. You're ruining him. You're ruining my family over a parking space. Over an hour. Is this really what you want? Are you really this cruel? For just a moment, Marcus felt the weight of her words. Was he being cruel? Had he escalated something that could have been resolved with forgiveness and neighborly compromise? Then he remembered the website, the flyers, the sustained campaign to destroy his reputation. This started when you refused to move your car, he said quietly. I asked you politely. I told you it was my private property. You laughed at me. This is what your choices have created. So you're destroying my child as punishment. I'm reporting a crime that occurred on my property. What you do with that is your choice. Karen stared at him with such hatred that Marcus felt something cold slip down his spine. This was no longer anger between neighbors. This was enmity. This was war. Your life is going to get very difficult, Karen said, her voice barely above a whisper. You think you've won something, you think justice has been served, but I'm not done with you. She left, and Marcus knew with absolute certainty that she meant every word. The police continued to build their case against the son, whose name, Marcus learned, was Derek. There was enough evidence, the spray paint, the trespassing, Marcus's account, to support charges. Derek would be charged with vandalism and criminal trespassing, with a preliminary hearing set for early October. Marcus kept expecting more escalation, more retaliation. But Karen seemed quiet. The website stayed live but wasn't updated. The flyers didn't reappear. It was the calm before the storm, and Marcus found himself waiting for it with a dread that was almost worse than active conflict. The break came on a Saturday afternoon, almost 3 weeks after the vandalism attempt. Marcus was at home when he heard the first sirens. His initial thought was that something was happening at the hospital or perhaps somewhere else in the neighborhood. Then he heard his address mentioned on the scanner, his address and the word fire. He ran outside. Smoke was billowing from his detached garage. The fire department arrived within minutes, responding with the kind of coordinated efficiency that saved his house but couldn't save the garage. The structure was fully engulfed when they got it under control. All that remained afterward was a smoking shell, still radiating heat. The investigators arrived within the hour. They were professional and thorough, walking through the remains with thermal cameras and evidence bags. Any reason someone would want to target this garage specifically? The lead investigator asked. His name was Hartley, and he'd been with the department for 17 years. I have a neighbor, Marcus said slowly. We've been having disputes. She's been harassing me, websites, flyers, and her son vandalized my property a few weeks ago. She threatened me, said my life would become very difficult. Hartley's expression didn't change, but Marcus saw something shift behind his eyes. Recognition, understanding. I see. Well, this wasn't an accident, Mr. Chen. Someone deliberately set this fire. We found accelerant residue and the burn pattern suggests intentional origin points. This is arson. Marcus felt the world tilt slightly. Arson, not just vandalism or harassment. Arson. You need to tell your neighbor's name to the police. We'll open an investigation. Marcus gave the investigator Karen's information. He also gave them the names of the websites, the screenshots of the flyers, the documentation of her harassment campaign. By the time investigator Hartley left, he was carrying a file folder that contained months of escalation. The police investigation moved quickly. There was security camera footage from a neighbor's property showing a vehicle matching Karen's Range Rover parked near the alley behind Marcus's property around the time the fire started. Investigators found accelerant residue on Derek's clothing when they brought him in for questioning. Karen wasn't arrested, but Derek was charged with arson in addition to his previous charges. This time, Karen didn't come to Marcus's door. Instead, she hired a lawyer, a real one, expensive and aggressive, and filed a countersuit claiming Marcus's harassment campaign had caused her family emotional distress and accusing him of manufacturing evidence to frame her and her son. Richard Mather laughed when Marcus told him about the countersuit. She's desperate. Arson is a felony. She's panicking. Mather leaned back in his chair. This actually works in your favor. Her actions have escalated from annoying to genuinely criminal. The judge will see that. If you want to pursue damages, you have a real case now. But what Marcus wanted wasn't damages. He wanted his life back. He wanted the weeks before Karen parked her car in his yard. He wanted a neighborhood where he could live peacefully in his own home without fear of retaliation. The local news, which had initially covered the neighborhood dispute with a tone of mild amusement, shifted its approach entirely when arson charges were filed. The story became serious. Parking dispute escalates 2 felony charges. Marcus's name was still featured prominently, but now as a victim rather than a perpetrator. Karen's website, once referenced as a concerned neighbor's warning, was now cited as evidence of a harassment campaign. The public narrative reversed completely. What was strange to Marcus was how little satisfaction this reversal brought. Yes, he'd been vindicated. Yes, everyone could now see that Karen had been the aggressor, but the damage to both their lives was done. Derek was facing serious felony charges. Karen was facing criminal investigation. And Marcus had lost his privacy, his peace, and his ability to feel safe in his own home. Derek's preliminary hearing was held in the basement courtroom of the county building, a utilitarian space with fluorescent lights and wooden benches that smelled faintly of industrial cleaner. Marcus attended, not because he wanted to, but because the prosecutor asked him to. His presence, her office explained, showed the judge that this was serious, that there was a real victim, that this wasn't just 2 neighbors feuding. Derek arrived with his expensive lawyer and Karen, who wore a dark dress and an expression of weary resignation. She didn't look at Marcus. Derek, however, looked at him once when entering the courtroom, and Marcus saw something in the boy's face that hadn't been there before, genuine remorse mixed with terror. The prosecutor presented the evidence, the accelerant, the security footage, Derek's statement to police in which he eventually admitted his mother had asked him to make a problem go away if the criminal case against him proceeded. He hadn't understood what she meant, he'd said, but when she mentioned Marcus's garage and gave him money for materials, he'd realized. "She didn't ask me to burn it," Derek testified, his voice shaking. "She just said she wanted him to have problems too. She said it wasn't fair that he wasn't suffering like we were." The lawyer objected immediately, asking the judge to strike Derek's characterization of his mother's intent. But it was too late. Everyone in the courtroom had heard it. Karen's face, when her son testified, went very pale. The judge ordered Derek to stand trial for arson and criminal trespassing. Bail was set at $50,000. Karen posted it immediately, and Derek was released into her custody with strict conditions. No contact with Marcus, no approaching his property, home monitoring via ankle bracelet. Outside the courtroom, Karen's lawyer approached Marcus. Her name was Patricia Knowles, and she had the kind of presence that came from winning a lot of cases. "My client wants to settle this," Knowles said. "She's willing to pay for the damage to your property, your legal fees, and accept a monetary settlement for emotional distress. In exchange, she wants you to consider whether the criminal charges are proportional to a family dispute that got out of hand." "She burned down my garage," Marcus said flatly. "Her son, acting without explicit instruction, set a fire. There's a difference. Karen is willing to compensate you significantly. I think you'd be wise to consider her offer." "How significantly?" $250,000. Marcus's first thought was that this was a lot of money. His second thought was that he couldn't accept it. To accept this settlement would be to agree that Karen could commit crimes as long as she paid for them afterward. It would be to suggest that money could erase arson, harassment, and the systematic destruction of his reputation. "Tell your client I'm not interested in settling," Marcus said. Knowles's expression didn't change, but he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. "I think you should reconsider. Criminal trials are expensive, emotionally draining, and uncertain. The offer I've extended is generous. She's trying to make this right. She's trying to buy her way out of consequences." "Aren't we all?" Knowles said, not unkindly. "She's offering you a path to move forward, to put this behind you." Marcus thought about that as he drove home. Was he refusing a genuine opportunity for resolution because he wanted justice, or because he wanted revenge? Richard Mather had asked him something similar. $250,000 is substantial, Mather had said when Marcus called to report the offer. "It would cover your garage, your legal fees, and leave you with a nice sum, and it would end this. It would let her get away with arson. No, it would let her face consequences and make restitution. The fact that those consequences aren't exclusively legal or punitive doesn't make them insufficient. She's offering you money because she knows she's in serious trouble. That's the system working. But Marcus didn't want money. He wanted, what? For Karen to understand the harm she'd caused, for her to feel genuinely remorseful rather than simply strategic, for his life to go back to normal. None of those things were within anyone's power to give him. The trial date was set for December. Thanksgiving came and went. Marcus went to his parents' house in the city, expecting some form of normalcy, but found instead that his father had seen the news articles and had many opinions about proportional response. "You could have simply ignored her," his father said as they sat at the dinner table. "You could have let her park her car and moved on with your life." "I could have," Marcus agreed, "but I didn't, and here we are." "Here we are," his father echoed, in a tone that suggested here was not a place he was pleased to be. His mother tried to mediate, but the dinner was quiet and strained. Marcus left the next morning, drove back to his empty house, and sat with the fact that even his family thought he'd contributed to this escalation. Maybe they were right. Maybe he should have just let it go. The garage remained a blackened shell. Marcus hired a company to remove the debris but didn't rebuild. He couldn't face the cost, another $70,000 at least, and more fundamentally, he couldn't face the idea of improving the property, of investing more of himself into this place. The lot where the garage had stood sat empty, a black scar against the healthy grass, a permanent reminder of what Karen's hatred had wrought. December arrived with early snow and a growing sense of dread about the trial. Richard Mather worked with the prosecutor's office, helping to prepare Marcus for testimony. They went through questions multiple times, helping him articulate his side of the story in a way that would be compelling to a jury but not seem rehearsed or vindictive. "The jury needs to see you as a victim," Mather explained. "But not a vengeful one. You enforced your property rights. You reported a crime. You didn't manufacture evidence or push for maximum punishment. You simply defended yourself." "That's what it felt like I was doing." "That's what you need to tell the jury." The trial began on December 3rd, in a larger courtroom on the third floor of the county courthouse. The prosecutor, a woman named Sandra Liu who had the intensity of someone building a career on difficult cases, called Marcus first. Under Liu's gentle questioning, Marcus walked through everything. The parking incident, the escalating harassment campaign, the website, the flyers, the cost of hearing a lawyer, the loss of peace and sense of security in his own home. He described the fire investigation, the way the investigator had told him it was intentional, the moment when he realized his neighbor had, whether directly or through her son, tried to destroy his property. Karen's lawyer, Patricia Knowles, cross-examined him with surgical precision. "You were angry when Ms. Karen parked her vehicle on your property, weren't you?" she asked. "I was surprised and frustrated. Angry, though, angry enough to call a tow truck within a few hours. I asked her to move it. She refused. And when she refused, you immediately escalated to a tow truck. Not a conversation, not another request, but a direct removal of her property. It was my property. I had the right to remove trespassing vehicles. And you exercised that right immediately, without attempting further negotiation." "I had already negotiated." "For how long? 20 minutes, 30. She'd made it clear she wasn't willing to move the car voluntarily." Knowles walked back to her table, let the answer hang in the courtroom for a moment, then turned back. "When you had her car towed, did you know that would be the beginning of a conflict that would consume both your lives for months?" "No." "Did you expect retaliation?" "I expected she'd be angry." "But you did it anyway. You knew there might be consequences, but you were willing to accept them in order to enforce your property rights." This was the trap. If Marcus said yes, he was accepting responsibility for escalating a conflict. If he said no, he was being dishonest. "I did what I was legally entitled to do," he said, splitting the difference. "Which is not the same as what you should have done," Knowles suggested. Liu objected, and the judge sustained it. But the damage was done. The jury had seen the path that Knowles was laying out, that Marcus had chosen a confrontational response when a cooperative one was possible, and that this choice had set in motion a series of escalations, each one building on the last. Derek testified next. Under questioning from Liu, he described his mother's growing obsession with Marcus, the ways she'd spent hours researching him online, the increasing anger that had filled their household. When Liu asked him directly about the night of the fire, Derek broke down. She was so angry. She kept saying it wasn't fair, that he wasn't suffering like she was, that if he wasn't going to face consequences for towing her car, then she should make sure he had something to suffer about. Derek was crying now, his voice shaking. I didn't understand what she was asking me to do, or I didn't want to, but I wanted to make her feel better. I wanted the anger to stop. So you set the fire. I got the gasoline. I left it where she wanted me to leave it. I didn't light it. I swear I didn't light it. But I knew what she was asking me to do. Under Knowles's cross-examination, Derek was more defensive. Did your mother explicitly tell you to set a fire? She asked. No, but... Did she tell you to use gasoline? She said materials. She gave me money for materials. And you interpreted that as gasoline and a fire. She said she wanted him to have problems. She said the police weren't helping her, the courts weren't helping her, so she had to take things into her own hands. But she didn't say, start a fire on his property. Not exactly. Not exactly, or not at all. Derek didn't answer, but everyone in the courtroom understood. Karen had been clever enough not to explicitly order her son to commit arson. She'd created a situation where Derek had felt compelled to do it, but plausible deniability remained intact. The trial lasted a week. The prosecutor presented evidence. Knowles introduced expert testimony about teenagers under stress, about how Derek might have misinterpreted his mother's wishes, about the psychology of family conflict. When all was said and done, the jury had to decide whether Derek had intentionally set the fire, or whether he'd simply left gasoline where his mother had asked him to leave something, and the fire had somehow started accidentally. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They came back with a verdict. Derek was guilty of arson, guilty of criminal trespassing, guilty of destruction of property. The courtroom was silent when the verdict was read. Karen didn't cry. She sat very still, her face an expression of blank shock, like someone who'd been hit and was still waiting to feel the pain. Derek looked at Marcus for the first time with something like pure hatred. His teenage face twisted with rage and something else. The knowledge that his life, at 17, had been fundamentally altered by decisions his mother had made and he'd been complicit in. Derek's sentencing came in January. The judge gave him 2 years in juvenile detention, with the possibility of parole after 18 months if his behavior was exemplary. When Derek was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Karen finally broke. She sobbed, not quietly but openly, her whole body shaking with the realization that her child had been taken from her. Marcus watched her, and for the first time since the morning she'd driven her car through his fence, he felt something like sympathy. It was a brief, uncomfortable feeling, and it passed quickly, but it had been there. Karen faced criminal charges as well: conspiracy, accomplice to arson, child endangerment. Her trial was set for late January. Unlike Derek, she had the resources to mount a serious defense. Knowles's strategy was clear: paint Karen as a victim of her own emotions, a woman driven temporarily insane by the stress of conflict, who had made poor choices but had never explicitly commanded her son to commit arson. It was a smart strategy, and it worked. Karen's lawyer called expert witnesses who testified that Karen's harassment campaign, while inappropriate, was not unprecedented in cases of neighbor disputes. That the website and flyers, while hostile, were within the bounds of what many people do when angry and feeling wronged. That Karen's statements to Derek about wanting Marcus to have problems were vague enough to be interpreted multiple ways, and that it was Derek, a teenager with poor impulse control, who had taken those vague statements and turned them into action. The jury, after 6 days of deliberation, came back with a mixed verdict. Karen was acquitted on the conspiracy charge, guilty on accomplice to arson, acquitted on child endangerment. She would face up to 5 years in prison for the accomplice charge. When the verdict was read, Karen showed no emotion. She stood, thanked her lawyer, and nodded to the judge as if she'd just received a business update rather than a guilty verdict. Her sentencing was scheduled for March. In the interim, the town slowly returned to normal. The news cycle moved on. Other stories grabbed headlines. Marcus's name, once searched thousands of times, appeared less frequently online. The website Karen had created was taken offline. The flyers were long since weathered away. The neighborhood resumed its quiet existence, but it was not the same. Marcus and Karen did not speak. They didn't acknowledge each other. On the rare occasions when they were outside simultaneously, they existed in deliberate states of non-interaction. Corinne had sold her house, the massive modern structure with the oversized driveway, to a young family from out of state. She was moving to another county, taking with her the weight of everything that had happened. But before she left, she would need to be sentenced. The sentencing hearing was held on a cold March morning. Marcus attended, though he wasn't sure why. Richard Mather had advised against it. You don't need to be there, and it might be seen as vindictive, but Marcus went anyway. Corinne stood before the judge in a dark suit, her platinum blonde hair dulled somehow, her face showing the stress of months of legal proceedings. She looked smaller than he remembered. Her lawyer argued for leniency. Corinne had no criminal record. She had been under extreme stress. She had made poor decisions but had never actually harmed anyone. The arson was committed by her son, not by her. Yes, she may have created the circumstances that led to his actions, but this was a family tragedy, not a calculated crime. The prosecutor argued that Corinne had deliberately created a harassment campaign, had escalated her behavior when confronted with legal consequences, and had, whether explicitly or implicitly, directed her teenage son to commit a serious felony. Her actions had caused significant damage and had clearly demonstrated a pattern of escalating abuse when she didn't get her way. The judge asked Corinne if she wished to address the court. She stood. For a long moment, she said nothing. "I'm sorry," she finally said. Her voice was quiet, controlled. "I made poor decisions. I was angry, and I allowed that anger to poison my thinking and my parenting. My son is suffering the consequences of my actions, and I will never forgive myself for that." She paused. "But I want the court to understand that I never asked my son to commit arson. I never explicitly instructed him to burn down the defendant's garage. I made statements while I was angry, but I didn't intend for them to be acted on the way they were." It was a masterful statement, an apology that wasn't actually taking responsibility. She was sorry that Derek was suffering, not sorry for what she'd done. She was sorry that her words had been misinterpreted, not sorry for speaking them. The judge sentenced her to 3 years in prison, suspended for 2 years, meaning she would serve 2 years in prison with the possibility of the final year being commuted if she stayed out of trouble afterward. She would be released in 2 years, having spent 12 months of her life in a prison cell. Derek would remain in juvenile detention for at least 18 months. Both their lives had been significantly disrupted by the chain of events that began with Corinne parking her car in Marcus's yard. But so had his. The pool had become an obsession with Marcus in an unhealthy way. After the fire, after the trials, after the sentencing, he spent hours simply sitting beside it. Not in it. He still hadn't swum in it since the day of the towing, but beside it in a lounge chair, staring at the water. It was supposed to be his sanctuary. It was supposed to be where he came to decompress, to find peace. But now, every time he looked at it, he thought about Corinne, about her hatred, about Derek in his detention cell, about his mother's shock at the news articles, about the colleagues at the hospital who treated him differently after learning about the conflict. His mother called him in late March, after Corinne's sentencing. "Are you okay?" she asked. And in those 3 words was all the concern of a parent who has watched her child go through something she couldn't protect him from. "I don't know," Marcus said. "I won. The court agreed with me. She's going to prison. Derek's in detention. I'm the victim who was legally vindicated. But I don't feel like I won. I feel like I lost. I lost my peace. I lost my sense of safety in my own home. I lost my ability to just live without thinking about this." His mother was quiet. "What if I had just let her park the car?" Marcus continued. "What if I'd gone inside, ignored the violation, waited 3 hours, and moved on? Derek wouldn't be in detention. Corinne wouldn't be going to prison. The garage would still be standing. My life would be normal." "You can't think like that," his mother said. "She made choices. She escalated. You didn't cause this." "I responded to her violation of my property by calling a tow truck. She responded to that by harassing me. I responded to that by hearing a lawyer. She responded with a website. I reported the vandalism. She responded with arson. Every action I took, she escalated it further. So did I cause this, or did she, or did we both?" "People need to be held accountable for their actions," his mother said, but there was uncertainty in her voice. "If she hadn't violated your space, none of this would have happened. But proportionally, my response set everything else in motion. If I'd been more understanding, more forgiving. She burned down your garage, Marcus. That's not a reasonable response to a tow truck. No, but she was escalated into that over months of conflict. Months of conflict that started with a car. Marcus went to a therapist after that conversation. The same therapist he'd been seeing before the incident, whose office he'd stopped visiting once his life had become consumed with legal proceedings. Dr. Patterson was a woman in her 60s, with kind eyes and the ability to listen without judgment. I don't know if I did the right thing, Marcus told her in their first session back. About the towing. About everything. About calling the tow truck. About hearing a lawyer. About pressing charges. About testifying at trial. Every single decision I made seemed justified at the time, but looking at the consequences, I wonder if I made a series of poor choices that snowballed into tragedy for everyone involved. Would Derek be in detention if you hadn't towed the car? Dr. Patterson asked. No. Would the garage have burned if you had towed the car? Probably not. So by not towing the car, you would have prevented 2 felonies and 2 incarcerations and significant emotional trauma. But you also would have allowed someone to violate your property without consequence. Yes. These are the kinds of dilemmas that don't have good answers, Marcus. You can't be responsible for your neighbor's choices. You can only be responsible for your own. You acted within your rights. She responded with escalation. That's on her, not on you. But I could have prevented all of this by being more understanding. You could have, and you chose not to. And now you're dealing with the fact that your choice contributed to a situation you didn't want and couldn't have predicted. Dr. Patterson leaned forward. That's a very human thing to experience, and it's something you need to forgive yourself for. The days grew longer as spring arrived. The neighborhood came alive with new growth, with the return of birds, with the kind of hope that seasonal change promises. Marcus stayed in his house, maintained his job at the hospital, and moved through his days with the kind of mechanical efficiency that came from having already experienced the worst. Corinne's house sold in April. The new owners, a young family with 2 children, seemed pleasant enough. They waved when Marcus got the mail. He waved back. They didn't know about the history embedded in this place, the conflict that had shaped its soil. To them, it was simply a nice house in a quiet neighborhood. Marcus envied their innocence. One morning in late April, he woke with a decision. He was going to swim in the pool. It wasn't a small decision. It was the first intentional step he was taking toward reclaiming the space he'd originally meant it to be. He'd avoided it for 6 months. 6 months of a perfectly maintained but completely unused sanctuary. He put on his swim trunks. They'd hung in his closet, unworn during all of this, and walked out to the pool deck. The morning was cool but clear, the sun not yet high enough to warm the water. He stood at the edge, looking at the surface, and thought about everything that had happened since he'd stood in this same place watching Corinne drive her car through his fence. He dove in. The water was cold enough to take his breath away. For a moment, he simply floated, suspended between the weight of everything that had happened and the buoyancy of just being in the water, moving through the space he'd created. He began to swim, moving with slow, measured strokes from one end of the pool to the other. His body, conditioned by stress and poor sleep, felt heavier than it should. But the water carried him. The motion was meditative, the repetition of stroke and breath a kind of meditation on moving forward. By the time he emerged, 40 minutes later, he felt something shift inside him. Not healing. The trauma was too recent for that, the weight too heavy. But perhaps the beginning of reclamation. The pool was becoming his again, rather than a monument to what had been lost. That evening, he called Richard Mather. I want to understand what happens next, Marcus said. What comes after Corinne serves her time? What if she decides to continue the harassment? She won't, Mather said. Prison time changes people's perspectives, and her lawyer will have advised her that any further contact would result in immediate charges and likely mandatory incarceration for violating parole or probation conditions. She'll want to move on with her life. And Derek. Derek will serve his time. He'll be released as a young adult with a felony record. His life will be significantly harder than it would have been. He's lucky his mother had the resources to mount a decent legal defense, because that at least gave him some chance at a reasonable outcome. Do I need to worry about retaliation after they're released? I don't think so, but for the first year or so, yes, stay alert. Make sure your property is secure. Consider a security system if you don't have one. But I expect that as time passes, everyone will simply want to move forward. After the call, Marcus sat with that word. Forward. Moving forward suggested he had a destination, some place he was trying to get to. But what was forward now? His life had been interrupted and damaged. He couldn't simply resume the life he'd had before. He had to find some new equilibrium, some new way of existing in a world where he understood that kindness wasn't always rewarded, that fairness was often arbitrary, and that the consequences of standing up for your rights could be far more costly than simply accepting violation. In May, Marcus made a decision about the garage. Rather than rebuilding, he decided to convert the space into a garden. He hired a landscape designer, a woman named Patricia who had kind eyes and the ability to envision what space could become, and together they designed a meditation garden. Stone pathways, planted beds, a small water feature, trees that would provide shade in summer, plants that would bloom at different times of year. "It's beautiful," Patricia said when the design was complete. "What inspired you to do this?" "I wanted to turn the space into something peaceful," Marcus said. "Something that brings me joy rather than reminders of loss." "Consider it done," Patricia said, smiling. The garden was completed by the end of June. It changed the character of the backyard entirely. Rather than a scar, the space where the garage had been became a focal point, a meditation garden that Marcus spent time in on his days off, a space that was healing rather than haunting. In July, Marcus took a week off from the hospital and drove to the coast. He'd never taken a real vacation, always been too focused on saving money or maintaining control. But now, sitting on a beach, watching the waves, he felt the weight of the past 9 months lift slightly. His mother called him there. "I'm proud of you," she said, "for what you did, pressing charges, standing up for yourself, but I'm also proud of you for letting it go and moving forward. That takes more strength." "I'm not sure I've let it go," Marcus said. "That's okay. You don't have to fully let it go. You just have to continue living your life anyway, carrying it with you but not being consumed by it." In August, news reached him that Karen had been transferred to a minimum security facility downstate. Derek was progressing well in detention. Good behavior, high school completion on track, counselors nodding that he seemed to be engaging in genuine reflection about his actions. Marcus didn't take satisfaction in these updates. He'd expected to, but he didn't. The knowledge that they were suffering, that their lives had been disrupted, that they were serving time, these things didn't make his life better. They just meant that everyone was worse off than they'd been before. By September, a full year after the initial incident, the neighborhood had completed its healing as much as it could. The new family in Karen's house had already established themselves, their children playing in the yard, their presence overwriting the history embedded in the space. Neighbors had moved on. The news articles had been forgotten. The website had been taken down. The only thing that remained was memory, and even that was beginning to fade. Marcus stood on his pool deck on a Saturday afternoon in late September, almost exactly a year since Karen had parked her car there, and allowed himself to feel something like peace. The pool had become what he'd originally intended, a sanctuary. He swam in it regularly now. He floated on it. He sat beside it and read. It no longer felt violated or haunted. It felt like his. The meditation garden had become a place where neighbors sometimes asked if they could walk through. He'd begun giving permission, and on summer evenings, he would see families moving through the peaceful space, finding their own moments of stillness there. The garden had become not just his, but shared. The hospital had moved on from the conflict. His employment remained stable. His colleagues had stopped treating him differently, or if they did, it was subtle enough that he'd ceased to notice. He'd never hear Karen's name again. She would fade into the past as completely as any person could. Derek would eventually emerge from detention with a felony record that would shape his opportunities. But that was his path to walk now, not Marcus's burden to carry. What remained was not closure exactly. Closure implied the wound had healed completely, that there were no scars. There were scars. There would always be the knowledge that he'd been targeted, that his home had been violated, that ordinary conflict had escalated into felony charges and prison sentences. That knowledge would remain, a permanent part of his history. But what also remained was life. Continued, ongoing, moving forward life. Mornings when he made coffee and stood on the patio and felt grateful for the space he'd created. Evenings when he floated in the pool and felt the water hold him. Days when he worked in the meditation garden, planting new things, watching what he'd chosen grow. The most profound consequence of the entire ordeal, Marcus realized, wasn't what had been lost. It was what he'd learned about himself, that he was capable of standing firm in his rights even when doing so cost him dearly, and that he was capable of moving forward even after suffering consequences he hadn't anticipated. On the anniversary of the day Corinne had parked her car in his yard, Marcus didn't commemorate it. He simply lived his day as he would any other. He went to work. He came home. He spent time in his garden. He swam in his pool. In the evening, he called his mother and had a normal conversation about her week and his week, touching on nothing about the conflict that had once consumed both their minds. Later that night, he did something he hadn't done since the incident occurred. He Googled his own name. The news articles still appeared, but they were older now, sorted by date, fading into digital obscurity. The website Corinne had created was long since gone, erased from search results, no longer accessible even to the Internet Archive. The pictures of his address, his car, his supposed crimes, all gone. In their place was nothing, silence, the absence of story. And that, Marcus thought, was exactly what he needed. He closed the laptop and went to bed. Outside his window, the September night was cool and clear, full of the promise of autumn, full of the knowledge that seasons changed, and people moved on and life, however marked by loss and conflict and consequence, continued anyway. The pool sat dark and still, waiting for tomorrow when he would swim in it again. The meditation garden waited, holding its secrets and its peace. And Marcus slept, finally at rest, knowing that what had been broken could not be fully repaired, but could be transformed into something different, something that carried the weight of what had happened but was no longer consumed by it. Derek was released from detention in October, 2 weeks after his 19th birthday. He emerged into a world that was both familiar and changed. His mother would follow him into freedom 3 months later, in January. They didn't return to Fairmont. Corinne had sold her house and had no reason to come back. Instead, she used the equity from the sale to purchase a small apartment in another state, a place where nobody knew her story, where she could attempt to rebuild. Derek enrolled in community college. His felony record precluded many opportunities, but he found a mentor through a program for formerly incarcerated youth. He was doing electrical work, using his hands, building something tangible. The work was hard, but it was his, and over time it gave him a sense of purpose that he hadn't had before his life was derailed. Corinne found work as an office manager at a small business. She lived quietly. She didn't make many friends, and she kept her past carefully hidden. Sometimes, when she was alone, she thought about the man whose car she'd tried to commandeer, whose life she'd tried to destroy. She wondered if he was still in the house, still had the pool. She wondered if he thought about her. She thought about him often, in the way that trauma survivors think about the person who caused their trauma. Not with anger anymore, but with a kind of ongoing awareness that she'd been forever altered by the encounter. Marcus, unaware of any of this, continued with his life. He eventually started dating again, a woman named Sophie who worked in pediatrics at the hospital. She was kind and patient, and importantly, she didn't know about the incident. She knew that he had a pool and a meditation garden, and that he valued peace and quiet. She didn't need to know the cost of those things. They got married in the backyard, small ceremony, just family and close friends. The pool sat in the background of all the wedding photos, blue and serene, no longer a symbol of violation, but simply a beautiful feature of a beautiful home. 3 years after the incident, Marcus received a letter. It was forwarded through his lawyer, Richard Mather, who didn't open it but simply passed it along with a note. "Your call whether you read this." Marcus's first instinct was to throw it away. Corinne's words had caused him enough pain. What good could come from reading something she'd written? But he opened it anyway. The letter was handwritten on plain paper, the handwriting small and careful. It read, "Dear Mr. Chen, I've written this letter 100 times in my head over the past 3 years. I've never been able to find the right words. But I wanted you to know, even if you don't believe it or don't care, that I'm sorry. I was wrong about the parking, about the tow truck being unfair, about you being the villain of my story. I've had a lot of time to think about that, time I never had before. I've had to sit with what I did and understand that my anger, however justified in my mind, led to something that hurt not just you but my own child. Derek is doing okay now. He's building a life. It took him longer than it should have because of choices I made when I was angry and couldn't handle being told no. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that some consequences find their way back to the people they belong to, and I've learned that mine were justified. I'm not the same person who parked her car in your yard. I hope you're not the same person who called the tow truck. I hope we're both better. Karen. Marcus read the letter twice. Then he sat with it for a long time, not feeling anger or vindication, but something more complex. Recognition, perhaps, that they had both been shaped by this conflict, both changed by the escalation, both carrying scars. He didn't respond to the letter. There was nothing he needed to say. But he kept it, filing it away not as evidence of wrongdoing, but as evidence of something else. The possibility of change, of growth, of people becoming capable of understanding what they'd done. Sophie found him reading the letter weeks later, in the meditation garden, sitting on one of the stone benches. "Everything okay?" she asked, settling beside him. "Yeah," Marcus said, folding the letter carefully. "Actually, I think it is." He showed her the letter. She read it, and when she looked up, she had the kind of compassion in her eyes that suggested she understood without him having to explain. "Are you going to write back?" she asked. "No, there's nothing to say that would help either of us. The letter wasn't really to me. It was just something she needed to send, letting it go." They sat together in the quiet garden, the space that had grown from loss into peace, and Marcus felt the weight he'd been carrying for 3 years settle into something more manageable. The pool waited beyond the garden, still blue, still perfect. His life waited, continuing forward. And in another state, in an apartment Karen would occupy for the next decade, the woman who'd started all of this was also moving forward, also learning to live with what had been done, also attempting to become someone better than she'd been. Justice, Marcus had learned, wasn't about punishment fitting crime. It was about consequences finding their way to all the people involved, shaping them, teaching them, leaving them forever marked by the choices they'd made. He'd been marked, so had Karen, so had Derek. But they were also all still alive, still capable of change, still able to build something better from the wreckage of what had been destroyed. And in the end, perhaps that was the only kind of justice that mattered.